"Ma'am, take one more step, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The words cracked through the warm Georgia afternoon so sharply that every conversation on the quiet suburban street seemed to disappear at once. Naomi Brooks stopped before placing her grocery bag on the hood of her SUV and slowly turned toward the flashing patrol cruiser that had rolled into her driveway without warning. The late sunlight reflected across the polished brick home behind her, washing the white columns in a golden glow that made the entire neighborhood look peaceful, almost untouched by conflict. Children had been riding bicycles only moments earlier. A man across the street had been trimming his hedges. Somewhere nearby, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across fresh green grass. Then everything became still. Officer Ethan Walker stepped out of the patrol car with the stiff confidence of someone who had spent years believing his instincts were never wrong. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. One hand rested near his duty belt while the other pointed directly at Naomi. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered. Naomi blinked once, surprised more than frightened. She looked down at the reusable shopping bags hanging from her hands, filled with fresh vegetables, bottled water, and a birthday cake box tied carefully with blue ribbon. She had spent the morning preparing for her mother's 65th birthday dinner, a small family gathering she had promised herself would remain free from work, court filings, and difficult phone calls. She took one slow breath before answering in the calm, measured voice that had carried her through countless tense negotiations. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This is my home." Walker didn't acknowledge the sentence. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the house as if searching for someone else hiding inside. His expression hardened. "Identification," he demanded. Naomi shifted one shopping bag carefully onto the driveway, making every movement slow enough to avoid creating unnecessary tension. "My driver's license is inside my purse on the passenger seat," she replied. "You're welcome to verify everything." The silence that followed stretched just long enough for neighbors to begin watching from their porches. Curtains moved slightly behind living room windows. A delivery driver paused halfway down the block without realizing it. The air itself felt heavier. Walker took several deliberate steps closer, his boots echoing softly against the concrete driveway. "Funny," he muttered. "Dispatch said a suspicious woman was trying to enter this property." Naomi frowned. "Trying to enter?" she repeated gently. "Officer, I've lived here for almost 8 years." The statement seemed only to deepen his suspicion. Instead of looking at the mailbox displaying the name Brooks in polished brass letters, or the family photographs visible through the front window, Walker focused entirely on Naomi herself. The expensive home behind her and the confident woman standing in front of it simply did not fit the picture he had already decided was true. "People say a lot of things," he replied coldly. Naomi noticed the tiny red light blinking on his body camera. Without raising her voice, she looked directly toward it before meeting his gaze again. "Then let's make sure it records everything," she said quietly. Across the street, an elderly neighbor instinctively reached for her phone. Another resident stepped onto his porch, sensing that something deeply wrong was unfolding in broad daylight. None of them realized they were about to witness the moment that would change far more than one officer's career. At that instant, neither did Officer Ethan Walker. Naomi Brooks had learned years ago that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the strongest one. Calm had carried her through law school when professors doubted she belonged. Calm had carried her through crowded courtrooms where clients walked in feeling invisible and left believing someone had finally heard them. It had carried her through nights when she sat alone beneath the warm glow of her kitchen lights reviewing case files until well past midnight, convinced that justice was built one quiet decision at a time rather than one dramatic victory. That same calm now rested across her face as she stood at the edge of her own driveway with the afternoon sun warming her shoulders. The paper grocery bag she had lowered to the concrete leaned gently against her ankle, and the sweet scent of fresh peaches mixed with the aroma of nearby magnolia trees drifting through the neighborhood. Anyone who knew Naomi would have recognized the scene immediately. Every Saturday, she visited the same neighborhood market before returning home to prepare dinner for family or friends. She remembered birthdays without reminders, delivered homemade soup whenever someone became ill, and quietly paid school lunch balances for children whose parents had fallen on difficult times without ever telling anyone her name. To the families on Ashford Lane, She was the woman who always waved first, who helped carry packages inside for elderly neighbors, and who somehow remembered every child's favorite dessert. Few people, however, knew what occupied the rest of her week. Monday through Friday, she wore tailored navy suits instead of blue jeans, standing inside federal courtrooms representing families who believed they had nowhere else to turn. She specialized in civil rights litigation, often accepting cases that promised little financial reward but enormous personal cost. Friends frequently asked why she continued choosing battles that exhausted her. Naomi always answered the same way. The law only matters if ordinary people believe it belongs to them too. She never raised her voice when she said it. She never needed to. Even judges listened carefully whenever Naomi Brooks spoke, because every sentence came prepared, measured, and supported by truth rather than emotion. Yet outside the courthouse, she rarely mentioned her profession. She preferred introducing herself simply as Naomi. Titles, awards, and newspaper interviews stayed framed inside her home office where only family ever saw them. The polished wooden shelf beside her desk held plaques recognizing years of public service, but visitors were more likely to notice the photographs instead. One picture showed Naomi planting trees with neighborhood volunteers. Another captured her laughing beside elementary school students during a reading program. The largest frame displayed 3 generations of the Brooks family gathered around a backyard barbecue, everyone smiling beneath strings of summer lights. Those memories mattered far more to her than public recognition. Standing only a few feet away, Officer Ethan Walker knew none of this. He had not asked a single question about the woman before him beyond demanding identification. He had not noticed the framed family portrait visible through the front window or the handwritten birthday card resting near the entry table waiting for that evening's celebration. Instead, he watched Naomi with growing certainty that his first impression had to be correct because admitting doubt would require reconsidering everything that had brought him onto her driveway. Naomi studied him quietly for a brief moment, recognizing something painfully familiar in the rigid confidence behind his posture. She had seen it before in depositions, in court testimony, and across countless conference tables. Assumptions often arrive long before facts, and once assumptions settled deeply enough, truth had to fight simply to be heard. Officer Ethan Walker had worn the badge for nearly 14 years, long enough for routine to harden into certainty. Every morning began the same way. Black coffee in a travel mug. Patrol reports scanned without much thought. A quiet promise to himself that he could read people faster than paperwork ever could. Veteran officers often praised his decisiveness. Younger recruits admired how quickly he took control of uncertain situations. Few ever questioned whether confidence and accuracy were always the same thing. Over time, compliments became something more dangerous. They became proof, at least in his own mind, that his first impression was almost never wrong. The dispatcher had reported a call from an anonymous neighbor claiming a suspicious woman was attempting to access a residence on Ashford Lane. The description had been painfully brief. Female, black, mid-30s, luxury home. That was enough for Ethan's imagination to fill in every blank before his patrol car even turned onto the quiet street. He never considered that the homeowner might simply match the description. Instead, his mind reached for familiar conclusions shaped by years of unchecked assumptions. As he slowly drove past rows of immaculate brick houses, trimmed hedges, and freshly planted flower beds, he barely noticed the neighborhood itself. He saw expensive vehicles parked neatly in driveways and families enjoying a peaceful Saturday afternoon. Yet when his eyes landed on Naomi standing beside the dark blue sport utility vehicle, carrying grocery bags toward the front entrance, something inside him insisted she did not belong there. It was not evidence speaking. It was expectation. His academy instructors had once reminded every recruit that good policing began with observation before action. Listen first. Verify second. Decide last. Ethan had repeated those words often during training, but years on patrol had quietly rearranged them. Now he decided first and searched for confirmation afterward. Every answer Naomi offered became another excuse to doubt her. Every calm response sounded rehearsed instead of truthful. Even the confidence in her voice felt suspicious because it challenged the story he had already constructed in his mind. Across the street, Harold Jensen watched everything unfold from his front porch. At 72 years old, Harold had lived on Ashford Lane longer than almost anyone else. He remembered when Naomi bought the house after years of saving for it. He remembered helping unload moving boxes from the rental truck while she laughed about finally having enough space for a proper garden. Harold frowned as he watched the officer ignore the bronze nameplate mounted beside the front door. He glanced toward his wife, who had quietly stepped outside carrying a glass of iced tea. Neither of them spoke. They simply exchanged the same uneasy look shared by neighbors who suddenly realized that ordinary afternoons can change without warning. Several houses down, a teenage boy walking his golden retriever slowed to a stop. He recognized Naomi immediately from the free legal workshops she volunteered to teach at the local community center. She had once spent 2 hours helping his grandmother understand complicated insurance paperwork without accepting a single dollar. Now he instinctively pulled out his phone, uncertain why his stomach suddenly felt so tight. Ethan noticed the movement. His eyes briefly shifted toward the teenager before returning to Naomi. More people were watching now. More phones were appearing. Yet instead of slowing down, he seemed to become even more determined to prove that his judgment could not possibly be mistaken. Pride had quietly entered the conversation long before another word was spoken, and pride has a way of making simple misunderstandings grow into something far more difficult to undo. Naomi remained exactly where she was, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. She had spent years teaching clients that truth rarely needed to shout. Sometimes it simply needed enough patience to survive long enough to be believed. She had no idea that only a few miles away, a chain of events already set in motion earlier that morning was heading directly toward Ashford Lane, carrying answers neither she nor Officer Walker expected. The quiet on Ashford Lane no longer felt peaceful. It felt expectant, as though the entire neighborhood was holding a single breath together. A gentle breeze stirred the American flag hanging from Naomi's front porch, and the blue ribbon tied around the birthday cake box fluttered softly against the grocery bag at her feet. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. Everything about it suggested home. Naomi folded her hands loosely in front of her and spoke with the same steady tone she used inside courtrooms when emotions threatened to outrun facts. "Officer, before this goes any further, would you please look at the address on your dispatch screen and compare it with the mailbox?" Ethan Walker did not move. Instead, he answered almost immediately, as though considering her request would somehow weaken his authority. "I am asking the questions." Naomi nodded once. "And I am answering every one of them." Her voice remained calm, never rising above conversation level. "My identification is inside my vehicle exactly where I told you it is. My registration lists this address. My property records list this address. My neighbors know me. Everything you need to verify is already here." The words were simple, organized, impossible to misunderstand. Yet Ethan heard only resistance because he had already convinced himself that cooperation would look different. He glanced toward the sport utility vehicle, then back toward the front door, searching for something that would support the conclusion he had reached before stepping out of his patrol car. Across the street, Harold Jensen quietly shook his head. His wife whispered, "He is not listening." Harold answered without taking his eyes off the driveway. "No, he is waiting to hear what he already believes." Another neighbor slowly walked onto the sidewalk carrying a small watering can, pretending to tend flowers while watching from a respectful distance. A young mother paused beside a stroller. Two teenagers stood near the corner, speaking only in hushed voices. Nobody interrupted. Nobody shouted. They simply watched an ordinary conversation become increasingly uncomfortable because one person insisted on certainty while the other continued offering facts. Naomi noticed the growing audience, but refused to let it change her demeanor. She had spent years reminding clients that dignity was not something another person could grant or remove. It was something carried within, especially during difficult moments. She looked directly at Ethan again. "Officer, would you like me to slowly retrieve my identification while you observe every movement?" For the briefest moment, hesitation crossed his face. It disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. "Stay exactly where you are," he replied. "Do not touch the vehicle." Naomi lowered her hands again, without argument. "All right." That single response seemed almost to frustrate him. He had expected confrontation. He had prepared himself for excuses, raised voices, or attempts to leave. Instead, Every answer she gave was measured, respectful, and completely consistent. The blinking red light on his body camera continued recording every second. So did several phones held quietly by neighbors who sensed that accuracy might matter later. A faint notification sounded from Ethan's radio. Dispatch requested a routine status update. He pressed the microphone clipped to his shoulder. Situation is still active, he reported. Continuing investigation. Naomi heard the phrase and gently tilted her head. Investigation, she thought. An investigation normally began with questions. This one had begun with conclusions. Before either of them spoke again, the distant sound of another vehicle approached from the far end of the street. It was not traveling fast. It did not use emergency lights or a siren. Even so, something about its slow, deliberate arrival caused several neighbors to turn their heads at exactly the same moment, while Ethan remained focused only on the woman standing quietly in front of him, unaware that the next few minutes would test not only his judgment, but everything he believed about certainty itself. The approaching vehicle rolled silently onto Ashford Lane before coming to a smooth stop nearly 50 feet away. It was a dark, gray sport utility vehicle with ordinary state license plates, the kind that blended easily into traffic and attracted little attention. Nobody stepped out immediately. The engine remained running, almost hidden beneath the distant hum of lawn equipment somewhere farther down the block. Ethan Walker barely glanced in its direction before returning his attention to Naomi. Whatever had arrived, he assumed it could wait. In his mind, finishing the situation in front of him mattered more than anything else. Naomi noticed the vehicle but chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, she focused on the conversation she still hoped could end with reason rather than embarrassment. "Officer Walker," she said gently after reading the name stitched across his uniform. "You still have an opportunity to verify everything before this becomes something neither of us wants." Hearing his own name spoken so calmly unsettled him more than he expected. "You do not tell me how to conduct an investigation," he replied. "I decide when I have enough information." Naomi nodded with quiet understanding. Every investigation deserves complete information. Her answer carried no sarcasm, only patience. Around them, the neighborhood had become almost unnaturally quiet. Harold Jensen slowly stepped off his porch and stood beside his mailbox without saying a word. His wife folded her arms tightly across her sweater, watching Naomi with visible concern. The teenage boy still held his phone at chest level, uncertain whether he should continue recording, yet unwilling to look away. Even the children riding bicycles had drifted toward their parents, sensing that the adult's silence meant something important was happening. Ethan lifted the microphone on his shoulder once more. "Dispatch, run the name Naomi Brooks." He paused for only a second before adding, "Possible trespassing investigation." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not from fear, but from disappointment. She had spent years believing that words mattered because they shaped the direction of every decision that followed. Labels mattered. Assumptions mattered. Once spoken into an official record, they often became far more difficult to erase than they should have been. The radio remained quiet for several long seconds. Static crackled faintly. Ethan shifted his weight impatiently. Before dispatch could answer, another voice interrupted through the speaker. "Unit 12, stand by before taking further action." "Repeat, stand by." Ethan frowned. That was unusual. Dispatch rarely interrupted routine calls without explanation. "Copy," he answered, though irritation crept into his voice. Naomi heard the exchange, but said nothing. The dark gray vehicle parked down the street finally opened its doors. Two professionally dressed investigators stepped onto the pavement wearing navy jackets with official state identification clipped near their collars. They were not in uniform, yet they carried themselves with unmistakable confidence. One held a slim leather portfolio. The other carried a tablet computer already displaying several documents. They did not rush. They simply began walking toward the driveway with measured, deliberate steps. Ethan noticed them now. His posture stiffened instinctively. He recognized the insignia almost immediately. Internal Affairs Division. A faint crease appeared across his forehead as questions began replacing certainty. For the first time that afternoon, the investigators had not looked at Naomi first. They had looked directly at him. The lead investigator offered a polite nod before stopping several feet away. "Officer Walker," he said evenly, "before you continue, we need you to remain exactly where you are." There has been a significant development connected to this incident. Ethan stared at him in confusion. What development? The investigator glanced briefly toward the blinking light on Ethan's body camera, then toward the phones quietly recording from neighboring yards. His expression remained calm, almost reassuring. One that makes every decision from this point forward extremely important. The afternoon seemed to exhale all at once. Even the breeze that had been rustling the maple leaves moments earlier faded into an almost perfect stillness, leaving only the distant chirping of birds and the soft ticking of a lawn sprinkler somewhere across the street. Sunlight stretched across Naomi's driveway in long golden bands, casting quiet reflections across the polished windows of her home. Nothing moved for several seconds. Nobody spoke. The lead investigator stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who understood that the next few words would carry more weight than any raised voice ever could. He removed a thin credential wallet from inside his jacket and presented it to Officer Ethan Walker before carefully returning it to his pocket. "My name is Daniel Mercer, Internal Affairs Division," he said evenly. "This interaction has become part of an active administrative review." Ethan stared at him, trying to understand how an ordinary dispatch call had suddenly changed direction. "Administrative review," he repeated. "This started as a neighborhood complaint." Mercer gave a slight nod. It did. His eyes shifted briefly toward the blinking light on Ethan's body camera. "And now it involves evidence being preserved in real time." Those words settled over the driveway with remarkable quiet. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing from the beginning, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing slow and controlled. She had spent enough years inside courtrooms to recognize moments when silence carried more truth than conversation. She did not interrupt. She did not celebrate. She simply waited for facts to arrive in their proper order. The second investigator opened the tablet he had been carrying and confirmed a series of details before looking toward Mercer. A slight nod passed between them, almost invisible unless someone was watching closely. Harold Jensen noticed it immediately. Standing beside his mailbox, he removed his glasses and slowly cleaned them with a folded handkerchief, though they were already perfectly clean. Beside him, his wife whispered, "Something changed." Harold answered quietly, "No, we finally caught up with what was already happening." Ethan looked from one investigator to the other. "Nobody informed me about any review." Mercer answered without accusation, "You were not expected to know." That sentence landed harder than Ethan anticipated. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty replaced confidence. He glanced instinctively toward Naomi, who met his eyes with the same composed expression she had maintained since the patrol car first entered her driveway. There was no satisfaction in her face, no anger, no attempt to embarrass him, only patience. The kind of patience that came from believing the truth did not need assistance once it had the opportunity to speak. Mercer continued carefully. "Earlier today, our office received additional material connected to an ongoing investigation involving field conduct and procedural decision-making. We were already en route when dispatch notified us that your unit had responded to this address." Ethan slowly lowered the hand resting near his radio. Questions filled his mind faster than answers. "You are saying this was already under review before I arrived?" "Correct," Mercer replied. "Your body camera has now documented an encounter that will become part of that review." The words hung quietly in the warm afternoon air. Around them, neighbors lowered their phones slightly, sensing that the story unfolding before them had become far larger than anyone first imagined. Naomi looked briefly toward the birthday cake, still resting safely. Inside its paper box, the blue ribbon fluttered gently in the returning breeze. For one small moment, she allowed herself a slow breath. She knew better than anyone that justice rarely arrived with dramatic speeches or sudden triumph. More often, it entered quietly, one verified fact at a time, asking only that everyone remain still long enough to hear it. Daniel Mercer looked at Naomi before opening the leather portfolio in his hands, almost as though he wanted to acknowledge that she had spent the last several minutes allowing the process to unfold without interruption. She returned only a small nod. Nothing more. The neighborhood remained wrapped in an unusual silence, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves overhead and the distant sound of a train somewhere beyond the tree line. Mercer removed a single document and held it where Officer Ethan Walker could read the heading without taking possession of it. Earlier this morning, he began, our division received the final evidence package in an 18-month investigation concerning repeated complaints involving field contacts, procedural judgment, and constitutional compliance. Ethan stared at the page, then back at Mercer. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. I have never been interviewed, he said quietly. Not directly, Mercer replied. Because the investigation was broader than any one officer. We have been evaluating patterns, supervisory decisions, training failures, and documented encounters across multiple districts. The second investigator tapped the tablet once before turning its screen toward Mercer. Several timestamps appeared beside a secure evidence log. Mercer continued. Today's encounter was not the beginning of this review. It became the final piece that allowed us to complete it. Ethan felt the words settle heavily inside his chest. For the first time in years, he found himself replaying the last 30 minutes from the beginning instead of defending them. He remembered the anonymous dispatch description. He remembered seeing Naomi beside her own vehicle. He remembered dismissing every explanation she calmly offered before checking even the simplest facts. The certainty that had always felt like confidence suddenly looked painfully different when viewed through the lens of recorded evidence. Mercer turned one page. There is something else you need to understand. He looked briefly toward Naomi before continuing. Ms. Brooks is not involved in this review because of her profession or because of personal influence. Ethan instinctively glanced toward Naomi again. Mercer continued. She became connected to this investigation more than a year ago after representing several families in unrelated civil rights cases. During that process, her office voluntarily provided properly documented evidence that helped identify procedural concerns affecting multiple communities. Every submission was independently verified before becoming part of the investigative record. Ethan slowly shook his head, struggling to absorb what he was hearing. Naomi had never mentioned being an attorney until now. She had never reminded him of her experience. She had never attempted to use her professional reputation to change his behavior. She had simply asked him to verify the address. Mercer closed the portfolio gently. When we realized today's dispatch involved the same individual whose documented professionalism had repeatedly assisted lawful oversight, we redirected immediately. The statement carried no triumph. It was simply fact. Naomi finally spoke, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. Officer Walker, none of this changes what I asked you to do when you arrived. Ethan looked at her, unable to answer. I asked you to verify the facts before reaching a conclusion. The words were quiet, almost gentle, yet they carried more weight than any accusation could have. Around the neighborhood, people lowered their phones completely. Harold Jensen removed his cap and held it respectfully against his chest. No one celebrated. No one applauded. The truth itself had become enough. Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time that afternoon, realizing that the woman he had silently judged had not defeated him with influence, status, or anger. She had done something far more difficult. She had trusted the truth long enough to let it arrive. On its own, no one moved for several long seconds. The afternoon sun rested gently across the driveway, and the blinking light on Officer Ethan Walker's body camera continued recording with quiet indifference, capturing not only words but the silence that followed them. Daniel Mercer closed his portfolio without another explanation. The evidence no longer needed interpretation. Facts had already spoken for themselves. Ethan looked toward Naomi Brooks, searching for the anger he believed he deserved to find. Instead, he found only the same calm expression she had carried from the very beginning. It unsettled him more deeply than any accusation ever could. His shoulders, so rigid only minutes earlier, slowly relaxed as the certainty that had guided every decision that afternoon dissolved beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Ms. Brooks, he said quietly, his voice noticeably different now. I owe you an apology. The words did not come easily. They arrived one careful syllable at a time, stripped of pride and free from excuses. Naomi listened without interrupting. Around them, neighbors remained respectfully silent. Nobody celebrated the moment. Nobody whispered. Even the children who had been watching from nearby porches seemed to sense that something important was happening, something larger than a disagreement between two strangers. Ethan continued, lowering his eyes briefly before looking back at her. I made assumptions before I verified the facts. I should have listened. I should have checked the information first. I did not. For a brief moment, the only sound came from the sprinkler clicking steadily across a nearby lawn. Naomi glanced toward the grocery bag still resting beside her feet. The blue ribbon around the birthday cake shifted gently in the breeze, reminding her that life had been ordinary only a short time before. She looked back at Ethan with the quiet composure that had defined every choice she had made that afternoon. An apology matters, she said softly, but accountability matters more. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Daniel Mercer remained still, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. The investigation would continue. According to policy, reports would be completed, evidence would be reviewed, decisions would be made through the proper process. None of that depended upon what Naomi chose to say next. She could have demanded immediate punishment. She could have spoken with justified frustration. No one present would have questioned either response. Instead, she surprised everyone. Officer Walker, she said, I have spent my career representing people who believed nobody would ever hear them. I did not choose that work because I dislike law enforcement. I chose it because I believe public trust can only survive when truth comes before pride. Ethan listened without looking away. The badge is important, Naomi continued. People should feel safe when they see it. That only happens when every person is treated with the same dignity, whether they live in a small apartment or a large house, whether someone recognizes their name or not. Harold Jensen slowly removed his hand from his cap and smiled faintly. His wife reached for his arm without taking her eyes off the driveway. Mercer gave Naomi a respectful nod, recognizing that she had accomplished something no investigation alone could ever produce. She had transformed a moment of confrontation into a lesson neither paperwork nor discipline could fully teach. Ethan drew a slow breath. Thank you for giving me the chance to hear that. Naomi answered with the gentlest smile of the afternoon. I was hoping you would give yourself that chance. The breeze returned, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the passing hour. The tension that had gripped Ashford Lane slowly dissolved, replaced not by celebration, but by something quieter and far more lasting. Respect had finally entered the conversation where assumptions had once stood, and every person watching understood that justice had taken its first real step not through revenge, but through the courage to choose humility after truth had finally been heard. Several months later, autumn arrived quietly on Ashford Lane. The maple trees lining the sidewalks had traded their deep summer green for shades of amber and crimson, and cool morning air carried the familiar scent of fallen leaves instead of freshly cut grass. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Children once again rode bicycles beneath the afternoon sun. Neighbors greeted one another while collecting mail. Harold Jensen still watered the flowers near his front porch every evening, often smiling as he watched the neighborhood continue exactly as neighborhoods should. Naomi Brooks resumed the life she had always valued most. Every weekday, she walked through the courthouse carrying the same leather briefcase, greeting courthouse staff by name, and stopping whenever someone needed a kind word or practical advice. She continued representing families who believed fairness belonged to everyone, not only to those with influence or wealth. The events of that Saturday afternoon were never something she spoke about publicly. Reporters requested interviews after the administrative findings became part of the public record, but Naomi politely declined every invitation. She believed that justice should never become entertainment. It should become expectation. The official review concluded with recommendations for expanded procedural training, stronger supervisory oversight, and additional education focused on impartial decision-making. The investigation recognized that documented evidence, including the body camera recording and witness accounts, had provided an opportunity to strengthen public trust through accountability rather than denial. Those changes affected far more people than anyone standing on that driveway had realized. Officer Ethan Walker accepted the findings without public complaint. He completed every required course, participated in community listening sessions, and spent long hours studying cases he had once dismissed as routine. The process was neither quick nor comfortable. It required him to question habits that had quietly shaped his judgment for years. More than once he admitted that learning to pause before reaching conclusions demanded greater discipline than making fast decisions ever had. One crisp October morning, Their paths crossed again outside the county courthouse. Naomi had just finished speaking with a young family waiting nervously on the courthouse steps. Ethan was leaving a professional development seminar held inside the same building. For a brief moment, both stopped. There were no cameras, no investigators, no neighbors watching from across the street. Only two people standing beneath clear blue skies as sunlight reflected softly across the courthouse windows. Ethan offered a respectful nod. "I have been trying to remember something every day," he said quietly. Naomi waited. "Verify first. Decide second." A gentle smile appeared across her face. "That is a good place to begin." Neither of them said anything else. They simply continued walking in opposite directions, each carrying lessons the other had helped reveal. As Naomi reached the corner, she glanced upward. The American flag above the courthouse moved gently in the breeze, steady and unhurried against the bright afternoon sky. Behind her, the courthouse doors opened as people from every background entered through the same entrance, each hoping to be treated with equal dignity beneath the same law. The street remained peaceful. The wind carried scattered leaves across the sidewalk before settling again into silence. Some victories announced themselves with applause. Others arrive almost unnoticed, living quietly inside better choices made the next day and the day after that. Naomi understood that lasting justice was rarely measured by the moment someone admitted a mistake. It was measured by what changed afterward. With that thought, she continued toward her car beneath the warm autumn light, while the neighborhood, the courthouse, and the people within them moved forward together, one honest decision at a time. This is the end of our story. Thank you so much for visiting our channel and spending your time with us. We truly appreciate every view, every comment, and every moment you share with our stories. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like to support our channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to keep creating more high-quality stories for you. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next video.